Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Film Craic, the show where usually myself and Clive there talk about films that have fallen through the cracks one way or another, or are hard to come by, or were unjustly maligned or ignored in their time. And you may recognize a frequent guest of ours, Geno here, from this and from other shows we do. And so Geno has recommended we do a couple of films featuring the great late Tommy Cooper. So maybe, Geno, I'm really interested before we even kick into the films for you to talk about how it is that
Yeah,
you know who Tommy Cooper is, just because
this fascinates me as well. I
makes a
want to
certain
hear
amount
this
of
story.
sense that Clive and I do because we were children, who grew up with the BBC, with ITV, with Thames Television, all that stuff in our lives, and very sadly, I was watching the night that Tommy Cooper passed away. My dad is a big fan, and so yeah, that's one of those things that was kind of seminal moment in my life was then the realization the following day what had actually happened during that broadcast. But how did you discover Tommy Cooper?
Well, that's actually a really interesting story, and I apologize, ladies and gentlemen, for the background noise. There's an idiot working on cars in the parking lot of my apartment complex. Yeah, some dude seems to think that this is a car repair shop instead of where we live. So, apologies if you could hear that in the background.
I can.
Well,
I
anyway,
can't hear it, so
Yeah.
I think good.
Yeah.
okay, so how I discovered Tommy Cooper is an interesting story. I have a friend, and I want to give a big tip of the fez to Mr. Mark Giacomo. Mark Giacomo is a podcaster, much like we are here, and he hosts a variety of podcasts. Most popularly, he hosts the Walnut Grove Cast, which is a podcast dedicated to the Michael Landon series Little House on the Prairie. He hosts Dr. Quinn Cast, which is, of course, about Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. Avonlea Cast, which is about Anne of Avonlea. VHS Rewind, which is my personal favorite of all the podcasts that he has, where he discusses like his memories of things that he grew up with on VHS and such. And he and his co-host Chris Hassler regularly cover a Thanksgiving Day parade each year, so that's always fun. But there's a podcast that he used to do with his friend Alex Saltz, which was called On the Odd, which was a paranormal themed podcast where Mark and Alex would talk about weird things that have happened in the past and just the paranormal, supernatural stuff and odd occurrences and everything. Well, I was at one point an avid listener of this podcast, and one episode, had Mark and Alex discussing weird things that you could find on YouTube. And one of the things that, they talked about was the rather grisly footage of Tommy Cooper's death. And so they discussed it and they actually played audio from the video. And so I was curious about this, like this comedian who collapsed on stage and died, what? So I went to YouTube and searched for the video that they were discussing and found it and was, pardon me, quite shocked by what I saw. But at the same time, I was rather invested in this guy's bit, at least from what I could see, because unfortunately they chopped out much of his opening act before they get to where Sandy Lawrence, the dancer, puts the cloak on him before his collapse. But thankfully, gotta love YouTube, right? They have. If you enjoyed this video, you might recommend. You might like this other video that we recommended. So some of the other videos that they recommended were other Tommy Cooper videos. And so I was like, you know what? I would rather, since I was and still am to a certain extent a student of comedy, being a fan of Wheeler and Woolsey and all the classic comedy teams and wanting to get interested in more British comedy, I decided to go down the rabbit hole of, watching, some of this Tommy Cooper stuff to see if I would get into it. And I found myself absolutely enjoying every single minute I watched. Like from, the fact that he was wearing a fez, to the fact that, he was performing these bungled magic tricks, to the fact that, he was up there telling these really wheezy puns that are quite hilarious, the way he delivers them. And I just thought to myself, oh my God, I found the guy that I was looking for all these years, because of the fact that, not only does he do the magic tricks, but he also does the weak jokes that are delivered great, and everything. So it's like I found who, and I early on I Chris and Tommy the one man circus, because essentially he does the magic bit, he does the jokes, he does everything. And and it's actually through Tommy Cooper that I discovered songstress Lindsay DePaul, because there was one of his shows that he did in the 70s called Cooper, which had Lindsay DePaul on every show. So, and through him I discovered a lot of other acts and a lot of other people that never gotten any airplay over here. So I've actually amassed quite a bit of his material on DVD. This is probably the biggest, the best set out there you can get, sadly, from the now defunct Network DVD label. This is called Tommy Cooper at ITV, and this is essentially a 12-disc set of pretty much everything Tommy Cooper ever did for ITV. It's a great set to own. You could find it on eBay and maybe some other places, but this has like every single show he ever did, including some one-off specials that have never been released anywhere. So I have that, and then I have like books like this, which is like if Tommy Cooper ever kept a scrapbook, which is Tommy Cooper just like that, life and jokes and pictures, which is just filled to the brim with stuff from days gone by and just fascinating things. So I've been a massive Cooper fan now for a few years, and have always loved the man since I first discovering him. And I got to give, again, a big tip of the feds to my friend Mark Chacoma for, essentially turning me on to probably my favorite comedian of all time.
Funny, I mean, that connects to something we were talking about off air, but I think that's exactly the kind of thing. When you bring your love of something, or when you expose the world to something through the work you do, you never know how it's going to pay dividends for somebody else. And so I think it's always good to keep in your mind when we're doing these things that, like, hopefully somebody will see this and go down this rabbit hole themselves, and will find an enduring love for Tommy as well.
Well, it's interesting, Tommy. I mean, I don't see what you think about him, Nick. So I've kind of had an interesting experience with Tommy Cooper myself, because so growing up, Tommy Cooper, what I realize now in retrospect, I suppose, is that he was a little bit ahead of the curve, and to the point where, so he does the magic tricks that go wrong, and kind of what nowadays they call dad jokes or things that are, but what the appeal of him is he's just so likable. Like, he's so likable. Like, he can be and you just enjoy, you mesmerized by him. It's not necessarily about the gags, or it's all deliberately not quite right, and you're thinking he was doing this so long ago that it's not like now that would be considered a lot more hip, right? Or from like the 90s onwards, the kind of alternative comedy movement, people were doing that kind of deliberately not funny, or what was it, Neil Burger or something, the American
Neil Hamburger.
Yeah, that kind of thing. It's kind of in that vein, right? But because he was doing it so in my childhood, so he would have been in the same pantheon of, like, he's not the kind of the northern comics, the working men's club comics, Bernard Manning, people like that, right? So I grew up watching him thinking, I like him, he's likable. Basically, he's kind of old guard, kind of corny comedian, right? And what I realize now is that he was doing, he was kind of ahead of the curve, and now I kind of get the joke. Finally, after all these years, I realize, he wasn't just a corny old comedian, that he was doing something, like I said, very much ahead of his time, and I finally kind of get the joke now, and I like him even more, but it's taken a while for me to figure out, because obviously with the snottiness of youth, I was like, and you realize, no, you were the young idiot. You didn't get what he was doing, right? And it's funny because we'll talk about the two films and one of them in particular, but he did exist in that milieu, right? So yeah, so sometimes he's surrounded by, he's almost camouflaged, isn't he? He's almost camouflaged by being yeah, where we talked about when he died, for instance, that was doing the royal
Life from Her Majesties.
yeah, there we go. And again, typical example of that. That's what I thought of him. He's like very much establishment comic. Bob Monkhouse or someone is probably on there, or some people like that. And but he's kind of yeah, he's kind of, I don't know, he's kind of almost hiding in plain sight. And now I kind of get the gag. I really appreciate him more than I ever have before, I think. How about you, Nick?
I think it's funny. I would say it's a little bit different for me. I think I genuinely did appreciate what he was doing when I was a kid, and but I'll explain how that the nuance has. But I agree with you. I think now, looking at it now, I'm also recognizing just how outside the box and how kind of edgy, and that maybe in a way, when I was a kid, what was exciting to me about him was I felt like it could go off the rails at any moment. Not only did he seem to be like muffing all of the magic tricks, which was hilarious, right? But also kind of that feeling of awkwardness that comes from that, right? That deliberate playing with the audience's expectations. But then when he would start to tell stories, he would often seem to just lose his place. And you're always like, it's like this tight wire act with him where at any moment it's just going to fall apart. And the amazing thing is it never quite does. He always manages to kind of just hold it together. And that's where this tremendous excitement came for me. And coming back to it now, because I mean, I watched the films and I was like, you know, in a way, they are showcases for Tommy, but they're not the perfect showcase for him. Whereas I think his shows were, right. So I went back and watched several episodes of like the Tommy Cooper Hour, and I was in hog's heaven. I was right back to being a kid, but also recognizing, God, it's even more anarchic than I remember it. It's even more like mad than I remembered it being. Yeah.
Yeah. Tommy Cooper Hour on DVD from Network. I'm such a massive nut fan of his that I have that massive ITV set, but I also have the shows individually as well because I just love them so much.
Well, I was laughing out loud, which is funny. I didn't necessarily expect that. I thought I would raise a smile or whatever, but I actually laughed out loud numerous times during various bits. And I think, and again, you know, in a way, I've always judged people by their fans a little bit. And so like Lemmy from Motorhead has always been an enormous fan of Tommy Cooper and quotes him at least in one or two different Motorhead songs as direct quotes from Tommy Cooper.
I don't remember the Motorhead song "Glass Bottle, Glass Bottle."
No, but there is one that ends with "Just Like That."
Yeah.
No, there's no question. I'm pretty sure in his autobiography as well, he talks about Tommy Cooper being like that was his model for being an entertainer. And so between songs, he would always try to do a kind of a gag. There's an element of that in what Lemmy.
This is true. And you were saying the thing about the kind of high wire act as well, when you weren't sure why it goes off there. And I think that's one of the reasons when you do watch the sad footage when he dies on stage. I mean sad, but also in another way. I mean, like, what a way to go, right? Like he actually died in the middle of his act. So that's something.
People's laughter.
People are laughing because he collapses and they don't. It could be part of the act, right? This could
completely
be part of the act. It's just when
he would often
stays
touch his
there
heart
for a little bit too long,
you know,
and then people start kind of wondering, and then it cuts to a commercial break, right? And then I don't think they mentioned it until the next day or something, right? I don't think they said anything like.
Or it was actually the news that followed the Life from Her Majesty's broadcast, and if you want to read more about that, you know, and read more about Tommy Cooper's life, I mean, I'm not a shill or anything. I mean, I'm not getting paid for this, obviously, but I do heartily and heavily recommend this book called Tommy Cooper Always Leave Them Laughing by John Fisher, which is basically the definitive biography of Tommy Cooper. Let me just, you know, this is really the best book. I mean, there's another book out there by a guy by the name of Ian Carroll, but from what I've read, that's sort of like a hit piece on Tommy, you know, and has like a lot of misinformation in it. But if you really want to read the whole story, gills and all, it's in John Fisher's book, Always Leave Them Laughing. And what I read in there was that basically John Fisher was doing, you know, the daily chores, and he popped the tape in the VCR and, you know, just taped the show. And midway through, you know, or at the end of the show, you know, he turned it on to see the curtain call and saw that Tommy wasn't there. And then thereafter, you know, he got all these phone calls saying, "Ooh, did you hear Tommy Cooper's died? Tommy Cooper's dead." And then he saw the news bulletin on ITV transmission, and sure enough, yeah. So, you know, this shocked, you know, I mean, people here in America, at least, need to remember that, you know, the biggest comedians in Britain were not like the Monty Python guys or Rowan Atkinson or Benny Hill. I mean, Benny Hill was big, but, you know, Tommy Cooper was the biggest thing there at the time. And so to see, you know, the fact that this guy who had entertained people for like over 50 years was gone, you know, was a massive blow to the British comedy world and to audiences who had grown up enjoying his comedy. And then, sadly enough, you know, about a month or so later, you know, Eric Morecambe of the comedy team of Morecambe and Wise passes away. So really, that was pretty much the end of the old guard of British comedy, and that's when you get your Rowan Atkinsons and your other comedians that come along later. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it would have been. What year did he die, Tommy Cooper? Was it
84, I think.
Yeah, so there we go.
1984, April 15th, 1984, over 40 years ago now.
So it's an interesting period as well, because obviously it wasn't planned that way, but it does come right in that period where there would have been the changing over of the guy. I mean, it had gone on a few years, but you know, there would have been the alternative comedians coming through, and
Yeah.
so it's kind of
But I wonder if Tommy Cooper isn't a little bit like, so when punk comes along, there's this massive backlash against, you know, the kind of the 60s music scene, right? And they're trashing, you know, Johnny Rotten is trashing, you know, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as being out of touch. But there were certain bands of the old guard that they were like the Kinks, for example, that didn't get that.
Yes,
they were like,
yes.
You know, and I feel like Tommy Cooper was the kind of the comedian's version of that, where younger comedians wouldn't necessarily. There were other comedians that they would have been like, "Yeah, that stinks, that's awful." But
well, I think if he'd have lived, so the other thing that happened like a decade after, like in the mid-90s, was someone else we'll be talking about in these films as well. Frankie Howerd became cool again, right? Like Frankie Howerd was picked up by like students and stuff, and there was a slight kind of slightly condescending edge to it, but at the same time, they did come from a place of people did really like this guy, and they did. And if Tommy Cooper had still been knocking around, I think that would have happened to him as well, right? I think he would have been embraced by another, but he was gone by then, right? By the way, Nick, are you thinking what I'm thinking? If we can get copies at a reasonable price, shall we get Geno on?
Yes.
Literary as Feck, and we'll do that Tommy Cooper book.
I would love to do that book. Yeah,
if you're interested, Geno.
If you're interested, Geno, but yeah, I'd love to do that, the Tommy Cooper biography.
Well, you know, sure, absolutely. I would just have to find, you know, time to read it. And you know, if you want a bonus, if you want to get just the book, sure, go ahead and do that. But this massive thing right here, this exclusive DVD and book set, the Tommy Cooper collection, as they're calling it, has both the book and the DVD.
Ah, right.
Okay, yeah, okay. So that might be definitely
be the way to go, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we'll circle back to this, but I'm definitely interested in doing
Yeah, no,
that.
I as soon as you had that up, I thought,
Couple of books down the road, I would be very interested
yeah,
in
because
that
it's a
for
big,
sure.
it looks quite big, so it'll take us a little while to read it. But yeah, no, yeah, let's do that. Let's definitely do that. So anyway,
So
specifically,
before we go on, I wanted to say two
yeah,
things, and then we'll go on. There's one of which I want to believe is true, and maybe Geno, you know if this is true or not, and it might be in his Wikipedia entry that I read this, but there was some cracks about how Tommy was a little on the stingy side, and there's a story that I really want to believe is true, that he would if he took a taxi ride, that he would pay the exact fare, and then he would lean over and slip something into the pocket of the driver and be like, "Have a drink on me," and it would always turn out to be a tea bag. I really hope that that's true.
That is absolutely true. Absolutely, bar none. I mean, that's what Tommy was like. I mean, did you ever hear the story of Tommy Cooper and the Queen?
I don't think so.
Okay, Tommy was doing a Royal Variety performance, or yeah, I think it was a Royal Variety performance. And afterwards, the Queen came out and, shook hands with all the entertainers. And when she got to Tommy, she asked, "Hey, did you think I was any good?" And she said, "Oh, Tommy, we absolutely adored you." And then, she was like, then he was like, well, then in that case, would you mind if I asked you something personal? And everybody was like talking to the Queen that way. And so she was like, "Well, as personal as I'll allow." And then Tommy said, "Do you like football at all?" And she was like, "No, not particularly." And then Tommy was like, "Well, in that case, can I have your World Cup tickets?"
Nice.
Just like that.
I mean, I think too, if you don't know, if you've never seen, I mean, you've showed a few pictures of him as we've gone, but like he was 6'4".
Oh yeah,
he was a massive man, like, which just adds to the kind of, and then in the suit with the fez. I mean, the whole thing, it was perfect.
Yeah, I mean, because there's, considering the size of him, there's nothing even in the least bit intimidating about it. Like, he's such a gentle giant, isn't he? Like,
Yes,
nothing.
Right.
You would never, you'd see him walking down the street. You can't imagine like ever being frightened of him. You're just, "Oh, look, it's Tommy Cooper," right? It's like, yeah.
I mean, he was so recognizable that, like, when Tommy Cooper would like vacation in Egypt, like he would go to like local shops and be like, "Oh, look, here's a fez," and he would pick it up, and like the local vendors would be like, "Oh, you're not gonna go just like that?" And he was like, "Wow, do you know me?" And they were like, "No, it's just that every time an English person puts on a fez, they go just like that."
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll save the anecdotes because obviously we'll talk more fully about it when we do the book.
Yeah, if we do the book.
So,
yeah. But
yeah. So we can really go to town.
Films.
Yeah. So yeah. So what we got first?
Can I just say, thank God Tommy is in the Cool MIKADO, because I'm going to out myself right away here that was not a lot of fun for me until Tommy showed up. I could barely hear the film over the grinding of my own teeth, and I like Frankie Howard. I'm not a huge fan of Gilbert and Sullivan one way or the other, but yeah. The only part of this film that I in any way enjoyed was the 5 minutes that Tommy was on screen.
Well, Tommy Cooper and some of Frankie Howard's bits are quite funny as well.
Yeah,
a couple of his parts are.
And it's interesting to see the two of them together. But yeah, there's the bit with Tommy Cooper is the best. It's like,
well, I laughed out loud, which again did not happen at any other part of the film. But there's one moment where he talks about his wife.
"I'll be home late tonight, love," and opens the cupboard, and she's
his wife is in there.
That was brilliant.
My wife, my wife's been on a diet of coconuts and bananas. Nothing but coconuts and bananas all day. She hasn't lost any weight, but you ought to see her climb trees.
Exactly. He was a much needed breath of fresh air. But like, that's a film. I mean, is that one of the reasons we're talking about it? This has to have been very much an unloved film in its time. I mean, how long did it take for this thing to even make its way to DVD? I would wonder.
Yeah, it's no, it's directed and written by Michael Wynn.
Michael Winner.
Yeah.
Michael Death Wish Winner.
Which is
Yeah.
so bizarre. Yeah, before he became a beloved reactionary filmmaker and food critic.
And also set in Japan, but clearly not filmed there for the vast majority of it.
This must be the least Japanese version of the Mikado I've ever seen in my life. Like, apart from the people singing, "We're gentlemen of Japan," like you wouldn't even think it was set, right? And you got fucking I mean, Lionel Blair, right? Lionel Blair and his dancers. People who don't know Lionel Blair, I mean, I grew up watching Lionel Blair because he was on a TV show called Give Us a Clue, which was basically televised charades, right? But of course he was famous for being a dancer. But Lionel Blair in this film is supposed to be Japanese, and they don't even give him any makeup or anything. Just he talk like that, and that's it, right? And like
he plays Nanki, I believe.
Yeah, which I don't believe is a Japanese name.
I don't think so. Nope.
I've never met anyone of that name in all my years here.
Although that may be a name that's a holdover from the Mikado itself, actually, I think.
Yeah, I mean the Mikado. Yeah, same as I ambivalent. I mean, I enjoyed that Mike Leigh movie, Topsy Turvy, kind of about the making of but in general, I don't really understand. It seems like such a relic to me of a, like, I don't understand what the appeal of Mikado is. It's lost to the sands of. I suppose it would have been kind of exotic and informative, maybe.
Groucho Marx liked it.
Yeah. I think it's just one of those things that's just we've
maybe a zeitgeist, but that it hasn't.
I think so. Although it is interesting that they have that song, "Three little schoolgirls are we?" Or whatever. Yeah. Wow, how far back does the Japanese schoolgirl fetish go? It goes all the way back. Longer than you might expect. But I don't know. Are you gonna? Did you actually find this amazing, Geno? Are you pretty much in the same camp as us?
Well, here's the thing. I liked. I mean, of course, Tommy Cooper's sequence in this was the highlight. And it's sad that while he's second billed, he only gets a 5-minute scene. I wish there was more of him in the film.
Yep.
I mean, this really is my only exposure really to the comedy of Frankie Howard. And I would like to see more of him, but I just don't know where to start as far as he goes. I mean, I'd like to take the deep dive into a lot of the British comedians, like the two Ronnies, Morecambe and Wise, Les Dawson, Frankie Howard, and such. But as far as their careers are concerned, I don't know where to start with these guys, and maybe, you guys can give me a bit of an education on that. But I thought Frankie Howard was great, even though he absolutely hated this film. Yes. He hated working on this. He said it was, not only the worst movie ever made, but also the worst production or the only production he regrets ever taking part in. But I will say I did like Jill Mai Meredith as Yum Yum. I don't know what it is about British women of this time, like her and Clarissa Newcomb, who we'll talk about in the next film. But British women of this time, man, I don't know what was in the water, but man, they're delectable to me. Her, and probably my all-time favorite is Stephanie Beacham. But we'll save that for a different day. But yeah, like her, she was a highlight, just seeing her, in that film. She's cute as a button. There were some characters in this that annoyed me. I did like Stubby K.
Bernie Winters was having a really good time. I wasn't having a good time watching him, but he was clearly really enjowing himself.
It's funny. Bernie, speaking of other British comedians, Bernie Winters was giving me a slight Ken Dodd vibes.
Yes.
There's something a little bit Ken Dodd about him.
But I remember him being much older as a kid with his big Saint Bernard, right? He used to do stand-up comedy. Like initially he was part of a brother and brother team, right? With his
brother's in the film as well.
His brother's in the film too, yeah. But then later on, yeah, he reinvented himself and he did stand up with his dog, which I remember watching as a kid.
I don't really know much about it. But the other thing I did quite like was the John Barry 7 playing the MIKADO twist. I quite like that.
Yeah, that wasn't bad.
Number, that was all right.
And you're right. I mean, Frankie's stuff was definitely some of the least objectionable stuff in the film as well, even if he didn't.
Funny thing about Frankie Howard as well, apparently, was he was very much like a bit like is it Tim Brooke Taylor from The Good Deeds? Apparently, that kind of that exasperated thing that he did. I mean, it's not entirely manufactured. Like apparently, it was like Frankie Howard kind of did naturally have a certain amount of anxiety, and then kind of played it into his act.
I think a lot of comedians of that era just in a way played more exaggerated versions of themselves. I mean, so did we. Just recently read a book about Kenneth Williams, and Kenneth Williams appears with Frankie Howard in several of the Carry On films.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, that might be. I mean, Up Pompeii is obviously, I think, one place to maybe go next if you're interested in Frankie Howard.
Yeah.
But potentially look at some of the Carry On films he did, because then you'll get also a number of the other, like Bernard Bresslaw and a lot of those other kind of British, comedians of that era. And yeah, I mean, Carry On is a kind of a good place, and it has lots of cute girls. So it's lots of cute English girls of that era. So,
oh yeah, you'll have a ball. Although I can't get on with Carry On, to be honest. I still
I don't. As a kid, I liked them. We talked about this before. I liked them greatly as a kid, and so I still have a soft spot for a certain era, the middle ones, the high watermark. But I was going to say, this movie also, like, it begins with everybody flying on a plane, and then one of our characters starts telling us a story where he seems to be plucking people who are on the plane and putting them into the story. And I was almost like, is this going to end like The Usual Suspects, where it's going to be like, and I kept waiting for them to come back to the plane, and then it ends and we don't come back to the plane. It's like so it creates this frame narrative and then forgets the end of the frame narrative.
That would be good if Frankie Howard and it was Kaiser Soze.
I don't know. It struck me as a weird thing that because they were all in the plane, right, including Stubby K or whatever his name is, right, as the who was also quite good actually, as the.
I quite like
what's the line that I like from him? It's like when that really good-looking lady is up at the stand, and Stubby K gets up to leave, and he's like, "Hey, where are you going?" "Home to abuse my wife. I'd like to see her in that condition."
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Like his courtroom is like a boxing ring, isn't it? Is that
yes.
That's
yes.
an idea.
But also, the sets are so deplorably cheap and chintzy. Again, I was like, is this supposed to be because they're telling a story? So, like, in a way, this is a fantasy world that this is, because, like, I mean, that courtroom set is hilarious. Those windows, they're even kind of wonky. Deliberately, it looks like a child's fairy tale pantomime set or something.
The plank. I mean, again, I'll be interested to know. I'm assuming it's just Tommy that led you to it, but this is also kind of one of those beloved items of British, like this has a major cult, right, behind it. So
before we get to the plank, are there any like closing thoughts that anybody has on the previous film before we get into our next film?
I think unless you're a really big fan of whatever this even is, I think you're good to watch Tommy Cooper's 5 minutes. I mean, for me anyway, that's definitely the highlight. Maybe
Lionel Blair doing the MIKADO twist.
Yeah, but I don't know that I would go out of my way personally to strongly recommend it to people who might not know what they're getting into. I feel
the cool MIKADO is something like you find your own way to it if you it's not something.
Yeah, it's like Out of Preminger Skidoo, I think. It's very much of that same kind of ilk, I think.
Yeah, yes, but kind of,
Kitschy, 60s, kind of
Yeah.
like,
but kind of less enjoy. I think Skidoo has a certain car crash charm to it, right?
yeah.
Cool Mikado, less so, I think. I mean, yeah, struggling to say anything good about it, really. I mean, kind of interesting, I suppose, as an outlier in early Michael Winner, though. I mean, he was kind of like a hack who did this, did that, and before he became Death Wish winner, right, and then did endless kind of Charles Bronson
Mhm.
films. He was just another journeyman director. A few of his earlier films are lost as well, I think, right? I don't think they're available anymore. But no, I think let us move on to the plank.
Mm.
So
All right.
was it Tommy Cooper that led you to the plank, or was it something else, Geno?
Well, and here's the official DVD that I have of the film Region 2. It promises to be the uncut version, and I'll take them at their word for that. Also with the original poster artwork on that as well, which is what I like. Yeah, it was essentially Tommy that drove me to watch The Plank. And of course, reading up on him and reading how he and Tommy Cooper and Eric Sykes were such good friends, and um pardon me, they worked together quite a bit throughout their careers. Tommy did a few, or at least did one television special with Eric called the Eric Sykes 1990 Show. And also Tommy would come back in 1982 to film something with Eric called It's Your Move, where they essentially play the same characters, but in this case, movers.
Mhm.
And I guess we could describe what the plot of this film is essentially about two workmen who are finishing building a floor in a house, and essentially they have to get one more piece of wood for the floor, and so they wind up finding this piece of wood, and basically the film is basically a bunch of shenanigans where they wind up finding and losing this piece of wood that they need for their construction project, and hilarity and hijinks ensue with a bunch of notable British comedy names, or at least names that would have been notable at that time. Let's just run down a list here, like Jimmy Edwards, Roy Castle, Graham Stark, Hattie Jakes, and a very young Jimmy Tarbuck. Names that probably to our American friends would mean nothing, but to British comedy aficionados, those are some quite legendary names there.
Yeah. Other people, there's Kenny Lynch, Jim Dale.
Oh, yeah, Jim Dale and Bill Oddie, which was the one that actually surprised me because he's really young in this.
Johnny Spite, who
Yes,
famous for writing In Sickness
Till
and
Death. That's two part.
Yeah. Your fave, Clarissa Newcomb. Yeah, Hattie Jakes. I mean, so many. I mean, almost everyone in the film is
a famous comedian,
right? And
yeah,
worth talking about Eric Sykes a little bit as well. Eric Sykes, I know Eric Sykes is massive, but I feel the height of his fame might have been a little bit before my time, in the same way as Hancock, for Tony Hancock.
Tony Hancock, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not as familiar with, I know the name, I know he's around, I know he worked with everyone, but in terms of the Eric Sykes persona, I don't really know. And it's interesting to me because what you were saying earlier, Nick, that this isn't necessarily a great vehicle for Tommy Cooper because he's not doing his Tommy Cooper thing, right? And I'm wondering if this is this typical Eric Sykes, or I'm not quite sure. Do you remember Eric Sykes much growing up at all, Nick?
No, I mostly remember him from this because this is something that I definitely saw when I was a kid. Again, my dad would have been a big fan. And it's funny, I wouldn't say I do. For me, the most compulsively watchable part of this is also Tommy. as I said, I still think his yeah, you're right. His ultimate, the perfect Tommy Cooper is just Tommy Cooper on a stage with his props and his magic and his hats, right?
Right.
But this is still pretty great Tommy, actually. I think he's the heart of this, because he has that ability to do that kind of the constant double take, the constant surprise. He really does surprise and nonplussed better than almost any other comedian. And there's something really, really fun about just watching him constantly be like, "Hey, like, what?" And then, of course, it's virtually a silent film, which I think is probably worth mentioning too, right? Other than a couple of lines of dialogue and a few grunts and kind of, it's more or less, an homage or like a nod back to those kind of Buster Keaton,
Less Laurel and Hardy comedies, yes.
yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. It's kind of a throwback to those things. Now, here's the thing, though, and this surprised me. So, because like you, Nick, I remember this because this was one of those things that was like a legendary piece of television, and you'd hear about it, and every now and again they'd repeat it, right? Mm-hmm. And I remember it coming on TV. I didn't really know what it was, and I sat down and I watched the Plank, and I, at a very young age, like maybe even under 10, I think.
Oh yeah.
I thought like, this is, and I was a fan of the Laurel and Hardy stuff that was showing on tele. Like, I really loved The Music Box, for example, was one of my favorites when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was just, this is hilarious. Like, this was like before I started to get into, things like Monty Python or Blackadder mm-hmm. or stuff like that. I was enjoying the old slapstick stuff. I thought the Plank was just fucking absolutely hilarious, and I would have no reason to think anything would change, because it is such fundamentally mm-hmm. old school humor, right? Have to admit, this time, about as funny as an orphanage on fire. I did not find this amusing in the least, and no one was more shocked than me. I thought, why am I not connecting with this? I didn't get it. I didn't get the gag anymore. I was quite kind of surprised by that. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Take it away, lads.
I don't know. I had a much less extreme version of the same. I also remember loving it as a kid, but this time I did laugh. But it also, there was a feeling of like, I remember this seeming more groundbreaking to me when I was a kid, or in some way just more hilarious, I guess. But maybe it is to do with age, or having seen more of what it was at that point. I maybe hadn't seen that much of what it was referencing, but then having gone back and watched a lot more silent comedy and a lot more of that kind of people getting hit in the head with planks. But still, I don't know. I had fun with it.
I mean, I'm going to be transparent and honest here. I watched The Plank essentially not even, because originally for the show we were going to do something completely different, but after I had watched The Plank, I decided, you know what, let's get on here and let's discuss Tommy Cooper's cinematic endeavors. I mean, there's another film that we're not discussing tonight that he did do, which was, I guess, a boxing comedy called And the Same to You, which is even earlier. Mm-hmm. And when I saw The Plank this last time that I watched it, I loved it. I found myself laughing at several moments throughout the picture, and I was loving it. I mean, of course, I'm well versed in the Laurel and Hardy comedies of the 20s, 30s, and 40s and such, and I'm considerably well versed in a lot of other comedy, being that I used to upload comedies almost every week or so from my friend Ralph Solentano's collection. But even, watching The Plank this time around, I found myself really enjoying it. I loved Clarissa Newcomb. I thought she was gorgeous. I like some of the gags. Like, probably one of my favorite non-Tommy Cooper related gags was, the guy with the eye patch, who had the plank sticking out of his truck, and then Jimmy Edwards as the policeman, he winds up getting on his bike, and he's unbeknownst to him, he's sitting on top of the plank, and so he's riding alongside with his truck while he's sitting on top of the plank, and I found that hilarious. And there were a lot of good physical gags, like just them handling the plank and maneuvering around the plank, which was fun. And Jimmy Tarbuck, was fun in his part, and Patty Jakes wooing at Eric Sykes, and this, I thought, for somebody like myself who's totally alien to British comedy, unless Tommy Cooper is directly involved, I found myself heavily enjoying this. And if this is anything to go by as far as Eric Sykes' career and the careers of any of the other comedians that appeared in this, then please, I want to see more of this, because I heavily enjoyed this, and I'm sorry to hear that especially Clive did not really enjoy this as much as he initially did when he was a child. I really enjoyed this film. Do I think it's the greatest comedy ever made? No, but I can definitely see why it's heralded as such a British comedy masterpiece, and I believe it does deserve to sit on the shelf as some of those Monty Python films or the Carry On films or such, because I do think it is a good slice of comedy filmmaking and a wonderful tribute, in all honesty, to Laurel and Hardy. And I think, and this is going to be controversial here, but I think a better tribute than what Steve Coogan and John C. Reilly did for the biopic, honestly, because I think Eric Sykes really, I think he engrossed himself into the Laurel and Hardy universe and really imbued himself with these films. And, I think that comes off in these films. And Tommy, of course, himself being a fan of Laurel and Hardy, as a matter of fact, in his 1975 series, Cooper, for example, this series from Network, he would often have a Oliver Hardy impressionist on his show, as you could probably see there. And so, yeah, this is basically a love letter to, what these guys were growing up with on the telly, as it were, and in the movie screen. So, yeah, I definitely, like this film probably a bit more than both you or Nick did, Clive. Yeah. Now, as far as the 1979 remake of The Plank, which I'm sure Clive wanted to bring up, I have not seen that. The version with Arthur Lowe in the Tommy Cooper role, I have not seen that. But have either one of you? I know, Clive, you've seen it, but Nick, have you seen the 79 remake?
I watched the first half of it, but it didn't have Tommy Cooper in it, so. For me, and it is effectively like the third remake, right? So because originally The Plank was an episode of Eric Sykes' TV series,
Sykes and ...
yeah, and then it's remade and expanded kind of into this, and then it's shrunk again, because it's actually a shorter running time for
30 minutes long, and they added a laugh track as well, which is kind of disconcerting. There's a laugh track on the
oh, you're right, yes, yeah. But
Arthur Lowe instead
Lowe is no replacement for Tommy Cooper, as far as I'm concerned.
Although Arthur Lowe does do his Arthur Lowe thing quite well. Arthur Lowe, for those who don't know, was of the original Dad's Army, right? And Captain Mannering, right? Which was another thing I grew up kind of watching, but not really thinking was very funny. Although it's certainly funnier than like Allo Allo or something like that. But again, our old friend Lionel Blair returns. He's in this version. Jimmy Edwards and Kenny Lynch are in this version. But other than that, it's a new cast. You got people, Diana Dawes, Charles Hawtrey, Frankie Howard, Wilfred Hyde-White, Joanna Lumley, Kate O'Mara.
Joanna Lumley and Diana Dawes? I got to see this now, because I like Joanna Lumley in the rather controversial last entry, The Satanic Rites of Dracula. I liked her in that.
And Miss World 1964, Anne Sidney as well, who was in that Treasure, the Amazon film with Stuart. She's in it as well.
I mean, I can never stay away from a Doctor Who reference, but Kate O'Mara, that's the Rani from Doctor Who, I believe.
Yes,
it's like the female version of the Master.
Yeah,
like red hair. Okay. I don't think I watched long enough to see any of them. I think I probably watched the first 15 minutes, but I'll have to, maybe I'll go back and finish it off then.
I mean, it was no funnier, but
Right. But I'll say there were a number of gags that I really liked. There's one that actually made me laugh out loud, where I think it's Roy Castle's character when he goes to sit in the back of the moving van or whatever, and he doesn't realize he thinks the plank is a seat in the van, so that when the car drives away, he's sat on the end of it. But just, it was that moment of the car driving away and you realizing, oh, he's sat on what he thought was a seat. That worked for me. And then, am I wrong? But again, speaking of Doctor Who, is Roy Castle not in one of the Doctor Who films?
Roy Castle is in Doctor Who and the Daleks with Peter Cushing as Doctor Who.
Peter Cushing as the Doctor, yes, yeah.
And of course, famous for being the world's fastest tap dancer, right?
Yes, yeah, and a trumpeter too, right?
Yeah, because he used to again from childhood. He used to host a TV show called Record Breakers, which I'm sure Nick would watch as well.
Yes,
yes, and it was basically people on there trying to break various Guinness Book of World Records. So Roy Castle was in it as he's the world's fastest tap dancer, and he was a trumpet player, and they had different people on every week trying to break different records. I remember Big Daddy Kane being on to break the world's fastest rap record 1 week, and Norris McWhirter of the McWhirter Guinness Book of Records brothers fame would be on to adjudicate if someone would get into the Guinness Book.
Okay. And then I did like the bit with Bill Oddie, because I mean that gives me nostalgic childhood memories, because Bill Oddie, I mean, when did the Goodies start airing?
The early 70s, because it's kind of a Monty Python knockoff, isn't it? The Goodies.
It is, but I also wondered if it, now that thinking back on it, was it also a knockoff of the Monkees?
It might have been, yeah.
With its kind of like, like just like with them running around as in superhero costumes. I remember really, again, that's the kind of thing I loved as a kid, but I strongly suspect that I probably wouldn't be able to get along with now. I think it was probably quite silly in a way that, rather than actually funny, I think it was just, well, I think aimed at a 7-year-old, but I don't know if I would.
Well, it went one step further as well, though, because that begat, and then if you remember the Tumbleweeds, do you remember them? They were like one. Anyway, we're going.
Okay.
We're going off script.
Okay. Yes. But no, as I said, there was lots of it that I did enjoy. But I just for me it wasn't quite. It didn't quite reach the heights I remembered it reaching when I was a kid for whatever reason. But it made me think that I should actually, though, sit down with my mom and dad and have them, like, I was thinking about like Tommy Cooper generally. I don't know if they know that so much of that stuff's available on YouTube. Like so much of that comedy of it's really their generation, right, more than of mine. And I thought, I should. So thanks for bringing it up, Geno, because I wouldn't have probably thought to go back and watch any of the Tommy Cooper hour and then been so pleasantly surprised by how weird it is, how weird and genuinely funny. As I said, I thought it had aged better, whereas some of these things haven't aged well. It has aged, like Clive said at the beginning, that stuff's aged better. Like it seems even more groundbreaking now than it maybe, certainly than it did to me then.
It's also another lesson in sometimes people, for whatever reason, it's difficult to quantify exactly why, but they flourish in one medium and not in another, right? And so you're not really going to understand really why people love Tommy Cooper if you're going to go the cinematic route, right? You need to go to the TV shows, and it happens that there's a lot of absolutely fantastic, like you mentioned, Rowan Atkinson, for example, right? And I'm thinking, you're not gonna understand why Rowan Atkinson Once Upon a Time was great by watching fucking Bean or Johnny English Reborn or whatever the fuck that spy thing he does. You have to go and you have to watch the stuff he did on TV when he was younger, right? That's the stuff. And I can think of a whole bunch of great comedians who are fantastic on the television, but just
never
came
made
to
that transition to
films, it
movie.
just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I don't know why that is.
Is there any good Billy Connolly film, for example?
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know.
Comedian name here, right? It's
Yeah.
if you're going to go by their cinematic career, you're not going to get it. So you have to go to the source, right? So, and I think Tommy Cooper's probably a pretty good example of that, right? Like for whatever reason, cinema wasn't the medium for Tommy Cooper.
I was watching as well. I didn't watch the whole thing, but I watched the fairly famous appearance of his on Parkinson, right, where apparently a trick nearly, potentially, I don't know how, again, if it's true or not, but a trick nearly went wrong and potentially decapitated
Oh yeah,
Parkinson on live television. That would have been memorable. But it was the interview itself that really struck me, because again, it was so on the rails of like, or so close to going off the rails at any given moment, like just and yet it somehow works. That somehow it becomes more funny for it being so all over the place. You know, he would have been a hard guy to interview. I think actually would have been Tommy.
Well, like we said, watch this space for more in-depth, specific Tommy stuff in the future. But I think for now, if either of you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up, anything more to say about the plank or fucking cool MIKADO?
I would say what you need to do is go to YouTube right away, and certainly the plank is there, and by all means watch it, but definitely go look up the Tommy Cooper Hour. I think that, you know, that is him at his best, really.
Yes, I would agree. I mean, the only reason why I wanted to do this show tonight is, you know, because actually I didn't know that you two were even interested in, if there was a Tommy Cooper biography. I didn't even know if you two would even be interested in that. So really, I viewed this as my only in to talk with people who grew up with Tommy Cooper, to talk about that. You know, so that's why I selected these two films tonight, not because I think that they're anything great. I mean, The Plank arguably is a great film, and I, again, enjoyed it much more than both of you did. Yeah, I mean, if you want priceless, honest to goodness, great Tommy Cooper, again, the Tommy Cooper Hour, as Nick said, was great. His earlier series, Tommy Cooper, from 1969 to 1971 is great, and you get the added bonus of having guests like Eric Sykes, Ronnie's Barker and Corbett, and you even get an appearance by Vincent Price.
Nice.
Bernard Cribbins as well there, I noticed.
Yes, indeed. So yeah, there's no shortage of great Tommy Cooper material out there. Again, I just wanted to discuss these two films tonight, you know, not only as, you know, just curios of what could have been if Tommy had decided to go to film, but also because it gave me an opportunity to discuss quite possibly my favorite all-time comedian. So yeah, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Clive, for having me on tonight to discuss the Cool MIKADO. And, you know, the Cool MIKADO, you know, I like that film on its own merits. I think it's a kooky little slice of 60s kitsch, you know, sort of like something you would have seen at the drive-in, sort of like an exploitation flick. Really fun in its own way. Not a laugh riot by any stretch of the imagination, but fun in its own way.
Not even a laugh full.
Yeah. The Plank, you know, was a lot more enjoyable to me, if I'm being completely honest. So if I'm to recommend any of these films tonight, I would recommend The Plank, which is available to view on YouTube, as is actually The Cool MIKADO. That's also available to view on YouTube. Yeah, watch these films if you wish, but if you want to see genuine Tommy Cooper, watch his magic performances. And, you know, that's one thing that I wish he was afforded. You know, I know that his whole routine was to get the tricks wrong and everything, but I wish, you know, I mean, he did get tricks right every once in a while, which is great to see. But, you know, considering his prowess as a magician, I do wish that we could have gotten at least at one time a genuine magic show with Tommy Cooper broadcast on television.
Well, I
Right.
think that's the thing, right? In order to make it go wrong, you actually have to know how to make it go right.
Well, right. Yes.
So I think
Right.
he could actually pull off a lot of that stuff if he'd wanted to. But the thing is, he would just been
It's funnier.
yeah, it's funnier if it
Yes.
goes wrong, right?
Right.
That's what he was smart enough to figure out, right? That the world doesn't need another comedian, but the world
Or
does
magician.
need a Tommy Cooper, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, right. We are out of here, and
we will
yeah,
take
thanks,
this up
Gino.
again in
We'll
a
be
couple
back.
of months when we do the book.
Yeah, we'll do some more Tommy's coming back.
Mhm.
So, until then.
Whip.
Choose that.